I am so conservative.
Rationalize in my head. These are things I read.
And I'm going to talk about Willow Creek.
Okay.
Willow Creek, a few years back, had
remembered at the time when Will Rogers said, I don't belong to any organized religion. I'm a Baptist.
Yeah. I am so conservative. If you didn't jump to conclusions, you might not get any exercise. I am so conservative. Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. As culture continues its radical shift away from God, I have a riddle. Guess what happens after you are offended? Nothing. That's it. Now, be an adult and move on. In light of recent events, I should also point out that I really am so conservative that I can't turn left even when I'm driving. Those who may be new to this webcast probably need a trigger warning. This is not a safe space if you are easily offended by having your ideas challenged, or maybe even by our satire. Today's June 16, 2020, and this is broadcast number 194. Joining us is our friend, associate, and author of Game of Gods, Carl Teichrib, for this UN2020 report. And yes, he realizes that we are really offensive and comes back anyway. My name is Don Vino, and I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher, co-host, and resident COVID-19 tracker is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie, baby.
Good evening, good morning, good day, whatever it is, wherever you are. Welcome and greetings from sunny Florida, where the sun came out and cast its light on the palm trees, who saw their shadows, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our 12? Sponsors, yes, 12 more months. Our sponsors for this webcast include World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas whose time has gone. World's End Theology Outlet, and the Heresy Conservation Board, ensuring sustainable errors for the 21st century and beyond. And if you enjoy this webcast, or if it really annoys you and you'd like to inflict it on somebody else, and that's really what social media is all about, isn't it? To ensure your continued access to this program, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube. Don't forget it.
Don't forget that.
Hey, Carl.
And we have Carl, and I want to put this up here that people know that this also speaks to this issue to some degree. Carl's book, Game of Gods. You can go to our in the description below and order a copy, and do that. Help support his mission and ministry, and because we love what he does, and we're glad that he affiliates with us from time to time.
And that issue that it speaks to once again is.
Well, what does Game of God speak to as a general overview?
A general overview that humanity has three great desires. First, to be as God. Second, to find our own purpose, meaning, and destiny. And then thirdly, to build heaven on earth. And in essence, that's what I really use Game of Gods as almost like a survey that goes through those three action points, which stems ultimately out of Genesis chapter 3, and then the Tower of Babel experience. And how we're still repeating that and living underneath that shadow today.
So heaven is a place on earth?
Yes, apparently.
And
that could be a song. We could do a song with it.
And we have to find out our density. What is our density? You are my density.
Oh my.
So okay.
I'm going to springboard off on our first adventure into the UN here, because I got to thinking about this as we're talking about the UN 2020 report. And I like history, and Carl likes history, and Ron is like our resident history major in all things history, pretty much, because he's really old.
Yeah.
Actually, Ron Rose used to ask me what Moses was really like, so I guess I'm the oldest of the three of us. But I looked back on to say, okay, the founding of the UN. Why was the UN initially founded? And in the U.S. history site, we have this. In October 1943, a statement by 4 primary anti-Axis nations, Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, declared their recognition of a need for an organization after the war to, quote, maintain international peace and security. And that's at ushistory.com, pages H2055.html, if you want to look that up.
Well, what I found really interesting was they were actually using the phrase United Nations in official literature before the founding of the United Nations. It's actually, there are different things that were printed up, sometimes as joint statements between, as they put it in their anti-Axis powers. So it was just like a smooth transition to go from that to making it an official. And of course, there was the League of Nations. This was not the first time that they tried something like this.
Right.
Well, it didn't work out so well.
They didn't, and I thought I would start with that because then we have a theme here in the UN 2020. It was a virtual conference that Carl was at, and one of their points is a plan for global action. The UN we need to create the world we want. Now, they didn't ask you and I about that. Maybe that's not a world that we want, but it is a world that the framers here do want.
I would like a world without the UN. Can we have that? Can we work that in there somehow?
I'm guessing they didn't provide for that, Carl. So
no, they didn't.
So let's go back before we get too deep into this. Let's take 2 or 3 minutes and go, how did the UN develop? Who was involved? Or what sort of groups were involved with that? And why? And how has that changed to what we have today?
Yes, actually, this is a great point that we need to look at. The United Nations was basically was born out of the ashes of the League of Nations. And both the League of Nations and the United Nations had a lot of pressure from organizations and different groups to create the organizations that they were. Now, those groups didn't necessarily align themselves with any particular government. You could call them lobby groups or pressure groups today. We'd call them non-government organizations. And what's interesting is both with the League of Nations and the development of the United Nations, it was progressive Christians, the social gospel movement of that day, that really created the energy pushing towards, what we need is this grand vision.
Yeah. The United Nations came out of the ashes of the League of Nations. League of Nations came out of the ashes of Woodrow Wilson's imagination. And here was an American president proposes the League of Nations, and America never joins it. We never actually became a member because we knew it was hogwash. So
yeah, but it was a failed experiment, and at the same time, the vision of that never went away. What's I find fascinating is the Christian involvement with it. The social gospel movement was all about, let's create this League of Nations. First of all, it was called the League to Enforce Peace. That was an organization, and the title of what they were hoping the new league would be called. I mean, I love that language, the League to Enforce Peace. Yes, how do we get peace?
The question comes in my mind: was the UN ever, at any point in history, or maybe even today, I don't know, a positive force at all for anything? And I can only think of a couple of times when people even paid attention to what it was doing. The first, and of course there might be more, but I can only think of a couple. One was when during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and of course that made really high movie drama. I think the fallout from that was that the communist world learned to avoid having it being used that way. Here we were able to put on display their hypocrisy and their lying with pictures, and I think what the Soviets and Chinese said, well, we're never going to let that happen again. We're just gonna veto everything before it gets to that point. And then the other time, it wasn't nearly as dramatic, but it was when Taiwan left the United Nations because of the entry of the People's Republic of China. You couldn't have two Chinas, and they thought they were China, and that was, it was kind of like having two United Stateses or something. It wasn't going to work. So that was the image of the Taiwanese ambassadors folding up their suitcase or their briefcases, standing up and walking out for the last time. I don't think, have they gone back in? I don't know. Have they come in as Taiwan? I don't remember. But China would be very unhappy about that too, because they think of Taiwan as part of China. So but that's about the 70s were the last time that you would get, unless of course little Swedish girls who are against climate change go there, then all of a sudden it's big news again. But in terms of something that actually happened in the geopolitical world, that was about it. So yeah.
The Suez Crisis of 56 was pretty important.
Okay, so how many people, did a lot of people have televisions in 56, Don?
Some, but not a lot.
Okay.
It's important to keep in mind.
Postage stamp size screens,
Yeah, you had to get like these big sort of magnifying glasses to put in front of them.
Or a telescope. That always came in handy. It's like it's on TV today. Okay.
But it's important to keep in mind that in the United Nations, you really have a number of things that are happening all at once. It is a place where, especially at the Security Council, you have 5 major world players who use it as a platform to engage in high-level political wranglings and right, exactly. That does happen. It is also a place where there are practical things that are being done. I have friends who have worked at the United Nations, with the United Nations, on agriculture projects, and I mean, you don't see it necessarily in North America so much, but if you go to Africa, if you go to Latin America, if you go to parts of Asia, then especially in Africa, you see it having more of a footprint in terms of like development projects and things along those lines. And then you have another level to it, and that is the visionary side, and that's what you see a lot that takes place with the non-governmental organizations, groups that have this grand vision of how to basically make the world in the image we want that to be. Right. And that was there from the at the League of Nations, and primarily through, again, progressive social gospel Christians at that time. At the United Nations, when it was being formed, you had the same thing, the Federal Council of Churches. Here's a report from the Federal Council of Churches, which at that time was commissioned by John Foster Dulles. He led that commission, and the Federal Council of Churches were pushing what we need as a world government, and they were organizing world order crusades. The Northern Baptist Convention had a world order crusade. The Southern Baptist Convention.
You want to hold that up again?
Sure.
Okay. A just and durable peace. This is not police.
Not police. No.
But they didn't. So this is a piece that they didn't defund. Okay, go ahead.
But there you had the situation where again, lobby groups, pressure groups, campaigns, programs, stuff that maybe the general public, well, actually the general public back then were very much in favor of we want a United Nations. We want to make sure we never repeat the horrors of World War II. In fact, back then you had a number of World Federalist groups that were membership run. The World Federalists, United World Federalists, I believe, had over 45,000 members across the U.S. A lot of church people, including back in the late 1940s, early 1950s. You had World Government Sunday Crusades, where they would send out literature to pastors saying, "Hey, preach on this."
Yeah.
So there was this sense of we're going to create this vision that never became, what it was, what they originally were hoping for.
I heard that there were actually studies done that have informed the advertising world as a result of this, because TV was in its infancy, and people, businesses were constantly looking for answers to how they could sell their products using, advertising. And there were also questions that people had about that went into what we call today community organizing.
Right.
How effective are those kind of tactics? So my understanding, this was explained to me back about 30 years ago, they actually did a study to see how much it would help if you organize a community to put signs on their lawns promoting the United Nations, and they did, and they had all this literature and everything. They did a survey before this happened, and then they did the campaign, and then they did a survey after that. They found out it actually increased nobody's knowledge. It's like 0.1% of people felt more informed about the United Nations than before. It's just there was an apathy. It seems to me the apathy of American. I think the best movie depiction around that time was The Mouse That Roared. Do you remember that movie? The nation of Grand Fenwick declares war on the United States because California wine production destroyed its economy. So it claims it has something called the Q bomb. Well, anyways, it's a comedy. Anyways, that's about the closest you could come to a really good depiction of the United Nations. Anyways,
since the purpose was to, kind of eliminate war, I thought I would do just a quick search, and according to a wiki something or other, since 1945, how well have they done? It
good question.
Like 194 wars.
That's all? Oh. Yeah. So there haven't been. It seems like there have been that many years since then, but there really hasn't. So you're looking at about 2 wars a year, then, aren't you? On average, because what's it been? It's been about 75, 80 years since it's. It's been 75 years.
Yes,
that was the 2001.
This year is the 75th.
So that would be 2001. That was 1945 to 2001.
Wow, that's really depressing. I was less depressed before you said that.
Yeah.
So you figure that's like 55. Okay, yeah, that's like 3 wars a year.
3 wars a year, roughly.
So yeah.
They didn't do good. However, they're going to do better, which Carl is now going to inform us about, because they had a virtual conference where they had virtual ideas, I guess, right? It's a virtual conference, and
everything's virtual.
Everything's virtual. So
not virtuous. Let's not say virtuous.
Yeah, not virtuous, but virtual.
Virtual.
And so the UN, we need to create the world we want. Who?
I want to teach the world to sing perfect harmony.
Who is it that is engineering the UN that we need in order to create the world that they want?
Well, the event itself was part of a bigger process of events that already started taking shape in late 2018. Last year, there was a number of working group meetings that transpired. The Secretary General of the United Nations said, look, coming up to the UN 75th anniversary, because this year is the UN 75th anniversary. Coming up to the 75th anniversary, we don't want to have great big summits. We don't want to have great big forums. We want instead a global survey, and that happened. That was done. Approximately, from the figures I saw, about 13 million people were reached with campaigns and programs and school projects asking, okay, what is it that you want the world to look like, and how will the United Nations play a role in that? And then this year, because of COVID, even the United Nations meetings got canceled, and a lot of everything moves, of course, into the virtual space. And so the UN 2020 virtual forum happened in mid-May. And at that time you had the organizer behind it was the World Federalist Movement. And the World Federalist Movement is the largest pro-world government lobby group that operates at the United Nations. It operates within the State Department, within the European Union. It's got a pretty big footprint, even though the organization is quite small. But they've come up with some big ideas, like the International Criminal Court was their idea. The concept of responsibility to protect. The idea, it's a military doctrine. It's the idea that if a nation state is failing its own citizens, and the international community should have the ability and the responsibility to come in and intervene. By the way, NATO used that justification to go into Libya. So, I mean, they have had a pretty broad footprint in terms of some of the ideas that they've put forward.
Now, when are we talking about the UN going into Libya?
NATO did.
Oh, NATO.
What was that? Yes. Yeah. And they use that same doctrine, that same principle.
Since
and
Gaddafi?
that came.
That was attention.
That was the action that took Gaddafi out. But what was interesting was the language that they were using was the same language that the World Federalists were using in promoting their idea of responsibility to protect. So, I mean, it's a group that has had some influence.
So we have this theory called posse comitatus in the United States, which would prevent normally, unless it was like an extreme situation, the military from being deployed into a civilian area. And that's really what's being debated now with the Insurrection Act and all that. I mean, they're not using the phrase posse comitatus, but that's kind of like looming in the background there. And to use a military force to put down a problem in another country is really, I mean, it's like goes against our cultural instincts, our ideas of justice. So I guess it depends on how bad it is, really. I mean, we have deployed the military for outright rebellions. George Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion, Civil War comes to mind. So it's not like it never happens, but it's supposed to be very rare. But I have a feeling if the UN was in charge, it probably wouldn't be so rare, especially if you've had 194 wars or more, since probably more now, because I remember a few happened after 2001.
Yeah.
Some of them involved our country, I think. Yeah.
But what's interesting, though, is Ron, this is, we have to keep in mind, this is not a North American thing. This is not the United States only. This is a global. We're the host. Movement of global development.
We're using our living room here, right?
That's right. Absolutely. And not just that. Your government helped promote and make it all take place in the 1940s.
You're reminding me that you're a Canadian, aren't you? You're trying.
Yeah.
It's a subtle. Your government did this.
It was your government.
Yeah.
up until the 1950s, the Suez Crisis. All of a sudden, the Canadian government, my government,
your government
said what we need the United Nations peacekeepers.
You have no internationalists in Canada, right? It's
like, we are a post-nation nation.
Who needed the peacekeepers? Who did they say? Who did Canada say needed peacekeepers? They them?
That was the Suez Crisis.
Oh yeah.
Back then, the world was in shock and was very afraid that you would see a third world war over the Suez Crisis. And at that point in time, Canada's Lester Pearson, who became our prime minister, stepped forward and said, "Hey, what we need is United Nations peacekeepers." And it was during that time of crisis that basically the world adopted that and said, "Yeah." In fact, the United States was saying, "Yeah, we need peacekeepers, global peacekeepers."
I love it when you have like these situations where like you got a gun. It's called a peacekeeper, or is it a peacemaker? I think that peacemaker gun.
Well, it kind of, kind of, and it also depends on what the purpose is. I mean, one of our sponsors has one because we have problems within the church at times.
Speaking of guns, right?
Yeah, speaking of guns, because some of our false teachers really don't like people pointing it out, and so.
Yeah, so they have they believe in there's like a spiritual Second Amendment or something that to defend their rights. And our friends at World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas whose time has gone, they have a special announcement for us. Your spiritual rights are under attack. People who oppose your teaching are criticizing you by name in public. Are you looking for that one verse in Scripture that says, if you don't like them, kill them? Well, we have something even better. The Benny Hinn Holy Ghost machine gun, because you just don't have to take it anymore. The Benny Hinn Holy Ghost machine gun is fully automatic, no waiting for results. It has high-capacity magazines to wipe out every detractor, and high-caliber rounds to blow their heads off in the spirit, of course. Benny Hinn's Holy Ghost machine gun, only available at World's End Theology Outlet. They have a huge stockpile of them there. You might want to look into that. I hear they're going like hotcakes now. So, anyways.
Yeah, Carl, you never know exactly what we might be doing next, right?
Wow. I give you guys kudos on your creativity. It's always something. It's always a surprise. Always a surprise.
For those who've been watching us, it's not much of a surprise. But,
not much of a surprise. Need some new material.
Yeah, we need.
But some of the organizations that are involved in the UN are like who? WHO.
Who?
Yeah. Who?
Well, of course, in the WHO is an entity within the within the United Nations itself. The World
I like
Health
that word.
Organization.
I think entity pretty much covers it right there. I'm not sure.
But what was interesting in the virtual conference I attended was one of the speakers was Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the
what? Say that name again.
Gro Harlem Brundtland.
No. Can you say that 3 times real fast? Okay, go ahead.
And Brundtland was the Secretary General for the World Health Organization during the SARS crisis, and of course before that she was, I believe, the Prime Minister of, golly, was it Norway or Sweden? I can't remember which.
Only Canadians say golly anymore.
She was all about what we need to do is look at pooling sovereignty over the COVID crisis.
Pooling
and that the World
sovereignty. Let's pool our sovereignty.
That's right. That's the language that ends up being used.
So let me get this straight. You pool your sovereignty and then inflict it on somebody else?
Well, it's the idea of global democracy. The world comes together democratically.
What if I just want to keep my sovereignty to myself? What if I don't want to share it with you? Then what?
Right. What if I want my own pool?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what's interesting, though, is one of the concepts at the UN 2020 virtual forum was that what we need to do in terms of going along the lines with global democracy, pooling sovereignty, is we need a type of global people's assembly, which is essentially a world parliament. And that was one of the ideas that was kicked out for people to consider. And of course, the organization, remember, one of the organizations backing up this event was the World Federalist movement, which has been pushing for a world parliament for a long time. The big questions then become, how does a world parliament become enacted? How do you elect representatives? I was at one World Federalist World Government meeting back, I believe it was in the fall of '97, and it was based around the question of how can cities play a part in creating a structure of world government. And so instead of having, let's say, sending representatives that you would elect, you would send mayors to a world parliament, mayors of major world cities. That idea has been resurrected again. There is actually a movement of mayors. I mean, big mayors from significant size cities coming together saying, yes, we need a kind of a world government run by mayors, not elected.
I wonder how their home governments like that idea. It's how they like the idea of their mayors going to a conference saying, you know what, I want out of my current sovereign situation, and I like to opt into yours instead. I think we have a word for that. It has 2 syllables and rhymes with reason. I mean, it sounds a lot like reason too. It's like you're basically saying, I want to. I mean, I think you're not allowed in this country to have how do you say it, to have divide your loyalty between. I don't know what you can do in Canada, but down here in the lower 48 here and the other 2, I don't think you're allowed to divide your loyalties between 2 flags, even if that other flag is the UN's. So,
well, the UN isn't asking you to divide your loyalty; it is asking you to be loyal to them.
But these World Federalists,
one of the workshops was to one of the ideas was to create a commission on global governance.
Well, that's another flag.
Tell us about that, Carl. What is the Commission on Global Governance?
I was actually surprised that they were suggesting a commission on global governance, because the Commission on Global Governance did develop a commission on global governance back in the early 1990s, and their big 400-page report came out in 1995, where they were saying, hey, this is not about world government, it's about global governance. The idea that we voluntarily, again, Ron, pool our sovereignty. We voluntarily pool our sovereignty instead of having it centralized through one final world authority. And so again, they're asking this time again for a commission on global governance. And I know a lot of it will be aimed at what we need is a World Health Authority, not just simply a World Health Organization. We need something bigger than that.
Wow.
Wow. Right. In fact, Mayor Nasser, who was he's the director of the outreach division at the United Nations Global Communications Department, described it this way: what we need is a multilateral system with teeth, and with teeth that bite. And that's how he was actually referencing. He was referencing the United Nations Secretary General in light of the WHO, and just looking to see, okay, we need to have a more robust World Health Authority.
Tell us that book again that you just, that these are the globalists in your neighborhood.
Actually, yeah, you nailed it, Ron. They are. They really, really are. What was interesting is this commission, which took place in the early 1990s, and again, the report came out in 95. This commission says in the first 10 pages or so, this is not about a world government. And then the rest of the 400 pages gives ideas on developing a global tax structure, an international military force.
It's not a government.
That's right. It's governance. You're pooling yourself. You're pooling it all together. And one of the ideas they suggested was carbon taxes, carbon levies, which, okay.
1995? That's 1995?
1995.
Carbon taxes.
That's
wow.
right.
They're ahead of their time.
Well,
and they use carbon
No, they're not ahead of the time.
Well,
right. And here's the thing.
It was kind of cutting edge.
Here's the thing. No, actually, this is the crazy thing. It's not cutting edge. The ideas that we're now implementing, and my country, I hate to say this, Canada, because we have a carbon tax. I'm paying for it. It didn't come out of Justin Trudeau's head.
No.
It didn't come out of any political leader that we have now. It was already being out for discussion, significantly out for discussion back in the mid 1990s, all the way up until, I mean, when I went to the United Nations Millennium Forum, one of our discussion points was a carbon tax. And so you have years and years of academic NGO discussions around these ideas. We go, okay, all of a sudden, poof, 10, 15 years later, your country's adopting it. Well, it didn't happen out of a vacuum.
I kind of was sort of paying attention back in the 90s. I listened to NPR a lot. I've refused to do it now. It's
you were trying to be liberal, but it wasn't working out for you.
The toxicity, the toxic levels of fabricated non-facts became toxic for me. So I stopped listening. But I remember it being there. I remember it being on the radar screen, global warming. But we barely had enough time to stop thinking about the ozone layer yet. So we were still like trying to, we had, you don't have too many crises, too many global environmental crises going at the same time. You want, and then there was also we're also still trying to forget about, cutting down the Amazon rainforest and losing all of our oxygen supply. They finally figured out that most of the oxygen actually came from the ocean. So, and you can't cut that down. They tried, but so we tried to slash and burn the ocean, didn't work. So I remember it was trending. Global warming was trending in the mid 90s, but I don't remember it becoming a big deal where people were. If you run into the average person and say, "Have you heard about the carbon tax they want?" that they would have heard about it. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't there, but that's why I say it seemed to be like a cutting edge thing in 1995 for most people. I mean, but you guys was old hat. In Canada, you guys are way ahead of us. You've got the next global disaster all lined up for us.
But Ron, you're absolutely right. The average person, Ron, you're totally right. The average person wouldn't know. The average person wouldn't care because this is not being.
I think even the average NPR listener wouldn't have known about carbon taxes in 1995.
Right. I mean, for the most part, it's unheard of unless you poke your nose into policy circles, and then all of a sudden you're going, "Oh, that's what they're talking about."
So, what is the next major global environmental crisis? Is it too many tweets or contaminating?
Well, for some people, they would say President Trump's tweets constitutes a crisis.
They're going to find something. Yeah, exactly. It's a mental health crisis. It's causing. It's like, okay.
But there's always talk of a crisis. I mean, speaking about mental health crisis or health crisis, yes. Back to the 1940s and 1950s, there was a lot of talk within the mental health community that we're having a mental health crisis and we need a mental health authority. We need to start thinking of ourselves as world citizens and seeing ourselves as part of a bigger picture. In the 1970s, there was, of course, you had the oil crisis. By the time the late 1980s comes around, we had acid rain, and then at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, the United Nations Global Summit on the Environment, it was climate change. So the Convention on Climate Change came out at that point. Again, most people didn't know, most people didn't care. Nobody was talking about this. Maybe in your neighborhood.
Right.
Didn't matter. Didn't matter. The world's policy. Yeah. The world's policy circles were discussing it.
Policy wonks primarily who are trying to move toward a one world government without, I mean, I feel like I'm in Star Wars a little bit. These aren't the droids you're looking for.
No.
Right. This isn't a one world government. It's one world governance.
Right.
And what's the difference? There's no actual difference that I can tell. They want to create a UN parliamentary assembly.
One of my favorite atheists is H.L. Mencken. The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous, to be led to safety by menacing with an endless series of hobgoblins, most of them imaginary. Sorry to interrupt, Tom. I'll stop sharing now. Go ahead.
Well, he's right. He's right. If you can keep people afraid, it is easier than to manipulate them. I mean, just a side note, when this whole COVID thing started exploding. Ron and I have talked about this a little bit, and we're clearly in different camps in some theological issues. But we were kind of in agreement on this one because I was getting bombarded with people going, is the vaccine they're developing the mark of the beast? And I said, no. And they said, how do you know? I said, well, let's take it this way. Right. If you are pre-trib rapture, then you don't have anything to worry about. If you are not, if you hold a different view, the first thing that has to come before the mark of the beast is the Antichrist, has to be in power, and then he initiates the mark of the beast. Since the Antichrist is not currently in power, no, it isn't. I mean, this is fairly, but people were afraid. They were terrified.
But what if you're a mid-trib or post-trib rapture person?
Still same thing. You got to have the Antichrist come in place.
Oh, okay,
It doesn't matter when you are on the scale. If you believe in the mark of the beast, then you have to believe in the Antichrist. And if you believe in the Antichrist, he's not in power yet. So it doesn't really matter.
But the question the question of vaccines, though, I mean, we didn't have these kinds of conversations on the polio vaccine or the smallpox vaccine.
Right. But we come back to this, which is the quote that Ron had, and that is, if you can keep people afraid and off balance, it is easier to sort of squeeze these things through that the elites have been dealing with for 30, 40, 50 years, trying to engineer ways. And I'm not convinced they're smart enough to do a world takeover, but they are smart enough to capitalize on a crisis.
It's interesting that Mencken wrote those words in 1918, the year of the Spanish flu. I don't know if he had that in, I don't know if he might, at least it was published in 18. He might have written it earlier. The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, most of them imaginary. It's when you get some Christian end times theory into it, it gets even more menacing to some people. Some people have a personality. I think there are some people that have a personality that they are just more naturally afraid. You know, it's not bad. I'm not saying it is a bad thing. Maybe I should say they tend toward the cautious side of the spectrum. Sometimes to the point of.
I think some people are, but I also have something I like to call the amusement park syndrome. It is the idea that you like to be afraid, but you don't actually want to be in danger. So you go on roller coasters, so you can be afraid while you're on a roller coaster, but you don't actually think you're really going to be hurt. And a lot of these conspiracy things operate that way. You kind of like the idea of being afraid, but you don't really want to imagine that you're going to be hurt.
Kind of immunizing yourself in a way?
Yeah, well, maybe so. So the things they were talking about, though, are to build back better, a commission on global governance, UN Parliamentary Assembly. What is that again?
The UN Parliamentary Assembly is this idea of creating literally a parliament within the United Nations, that they would make it a democratic world legislative body. That's the bottom line. I've got a couple reports right here on it. One's the case for a parliamentary assembly. Another one called creating a world parliamentary assembly. And this is a concept that's been kicked around since I attended the UN Millennium Forum back in 2000. It still is being circulated. And going to the question of having some type of a crisis, it's recognized that indeed, if we don't have a crisis of magnitude, you're not going to see movement in this direction. The last world government meeting I was at was in 2012. It was the International Congress of the World Federalist Movement. And while they were saying, we hope we don't ever have to experience a crisis, at the same time, the recognition is that a crisis of magnitude is likely what will have to happen. So as the United Nations was birthed out of World War II, and as the League of Nations was birthed out of World War I, it would have to be something of that magnitude, of that caliber, not just simply to lead to the next phase, whatever the next phase would look like.
Well, look at, right now, this is a good time for us to be talking about this, because we're seeing it happen right now in our government. Change is happening. Why is it happening? Because of a crisis. What promoted the crisis? Shootings of black people, or deaths, not necessarily even shootings, a murder, which I think most of us would say, yeah, what happened to George Floyd was murder.
Yeah.
You might say it's second degree, you might call it manslaughter, whatever it's called under the laws of the locality. It was a homicide, and it was an unjustifiable homicide. So, okay, and when you see these things repeatedly over and over again, you start to have a movement toward change. Now, this is how we got our Constitution. This is how we got our revolution. This is how we got all kinds of things. They lead to different levels. Sometimes they don't always lead to violent confrontation. For instance, the Constitution was in part caused by a violent confrontation known as Shays' Rebellion, but most of the other issues that led to the Constitution were fairly nonviolent. They were economic, political, but they were like, something's wrong, it's not working. So you get to the point where people are saying, what point would you have to get to? Let me put it that way, where people are saying this whole independent nations thing just isn't working. We need a one world government. Wow, what kind of crisis would that have to be? I think you're almost talking about another world war, I would think.
You would have to be. And that's exactly right.
Before people said, okay, enough is enough, we're going to have a one world government. I mean, I guess there could be something I'm not thinking.
I think you're right, Ron.
Maybe a disease that is
that is one of the things that comes into play here, because they're talking about using COVID as an opportunity to restructure global governance.
Yeah, COVID's not big enough. We've had bigger, and it didn't do that. I mean, Spanish flu didn't do that. We were in the middle of a world war when the Spanish flu hit, and the combination of a major pandemic that took more lives than the Civil War in this country took, and plus the war itself, couldn't even get the U.S. into the League of Nations. So maybe you could say that societal attitudes could have changed a lot in 100 years, and maybe that would. But yeah, a world war, I think, might be something. Yeah.
I mean, that seems to be, again, your historical trend line, is that when you have a conflict of that magnitude, then people clamor for it, whether they want it or not in reality, or whether it happens is maybe different questions, but people are screaming now for a savior. And that's really the interesting point, and that really is the point, that this becomes in essence an issue of faith. And as we see crisis and all of a sudden impending doom, people want a savior. They want to be saved from that action. And this is really no different. When you're looking at the United Nations and like this project, the UN2020 project, it really is saying what we want to do is make the United Nations our savior. It's a type of religious, philosophical movement. That's what it boils down to. But it plays out in the world of politics. It plays out in the world of academics.
Right now, I don't think there are enough people, at least in the United States, maybe, and even really in other countries, who really think they need a savior. I mean, I'm not talking about Jesus now. I'm talking about.
I would disagree with that. I think most people do think that. They just don't look toward Christianity as providing the answer.
No, I'm talking politically here. I'm thinking
even politically. If you're political, certain parties view the government as the savior.
Right. But I would say they're satisfied with the savior they have. If I'm talking about politically, militarily, whatever. In other words, I think most people. I don't even think Antifa is talking about the United Nations, is it?
Yeah, yes and no. They're talking about a complete system restructuring.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is if you want to see where people, what group, where you hear this kind of language, you need to look at the progressive Christians. progressive Christians do talk about what we need to do is build heaven on earth. And this is one form of that. Let's create heaven on earth.
They've always talked about that.
Always.
Watch
that
the
informs their politics.
Watch the movie Godspell. They're very careful to take, you look at just about every song in Godspell, and virtually every one of them can be drawn directly from the Gospels, especially the Gospel of Matthew, because I think it claims to be based on that. Except one, the song "The City of Man," where you're "Come sing me sweet rejoicing, come sing me love." We're all about, and we're gonna build a beautiful city, and we're gonna call it the City of Man. Now think about that. Augustine wrote a book called The City of God, Civitas Dei. And he contrasted two cities, the city of God and the city of man. And he said, Jesus came to bring us into the city of God, not the city of man. These liberal Christians in the movie Godspell are saying, we're going to build the city of man. Kind of sounds like Babel to me.
It kind of does. And, one of the things that we see this in the church, and we're talking about progressive Christians, and we had liberal Christians. Machen wrote his book, Christianity and Liberalism, arguing that liberalism is a different religion. We see this recurring theme of heresy, the same kind of heresies being used over and over. And one of our sponsors speaks to that issue, actually.
Well, yeah, they would think, you want to make sure that you get into that city of man, if that's what you want, if that's your particular thing. But right now, they're kind of concerned because the situation is dire. According to the latest research, at the present rate of consumption, our supply of heresies will be completely depleted by 2050. The consequences will be disastrous. If this happens, most cults will close their doors by the end of the century, and most heretical websites will completely disappear from the internet, not to mention the fact that 75% of what passes as Christian programming will disappear from airwaves and cable TV. The solution, though, is simple. Heresy recycling. Whether you're online, visiting a church, or out at the mall, you can do your part. Always look for the label, the HCB label, the Heresy Conservation Board, ensuring sustainable errors for the 21st century and beyond. So, Carl, you're going to do your part? Going to make sure all your heresies are recycled?
Speaking about recycling heresies, I had to look to see what I had on the wall behind me. Brian McLaren's book, Everything Must Change. Everything must change.
Written in the 19th century originally, so he just plagiarized the whole thing.
And at the time he did that book, he also became a songwriter. I have a copy of his song, "I Am an Atheist," on my hard drive here, and I go back and listen to it periodically, and I go,
"Really?
He actually is, yeah."
He'd written songs back in the 70s, so I downloaded those. He's an atheist now? What? No?
Well, that's the song, "I Am an Atheist," yeah.
Okay.
So allow me just to kind of put everything into full circle, back into what we've been talking about. I'm going to read a little section from Brian McLaren's "Everything Must Change," and he's quoting a gentleman by the name of Jim Garrison. Jim Garrison was Mikhail Gorbachev's right-hand man at the Presidio when Gorbachev had his foundation there. Garrison says this: "In an integrated world, governance, not government, is the key to effective management of a global system, because networks, not nations, are the emerging powers of the future." Now, this is Brian speaking. He calls for the strengthening of governance networks, beginning with the United Nations, for radical reform of the World Trade Organization, and then from a group of peer network organizations to be created, and on it goes. Then Brian continues on. The emerging judicial structures of the civil society movement will also provide accountability by molding public opinion, and when necessary, bringing people into the streets. And he continues, a framing story that envisions an interdependent, mutually committed global community of communities is a hospitable environment in which these needed networks can develop and flourish.
So,
Saying the exact same thing, basically, that the UN 2020 was saying.
okay, so did I get this right or wrong? He's contrasting government with governance or with governance networks.
The governance and governance networks end up becoming basically the same thing.
Governance is simply the act or manner of governing. And in other words, it is what governments do.
Right.
So how do you replace governments with what governments do without having a government? You don't.
In this definition, it is wordplay, but in this definition, and they have their own definition. In this definition, government is a centralized authority, whereas governance is centralized authorities can all operate together. We network. You come together voluntarily.
A global confederacy, in other words.
That's right.
A confederation as opposed to a federation. So these people would be in contrast to the world federalists who really want to concentrate power.
Yes, but even the world federalists use the language of global governance, because that definitely has a better tone in the public light than saying we want to set up a world government.
So they're using the word, but as camouflage, whereas the Confederacy people are using it sincerely.
Right.
You might say, yeah.
Yes, it is. It is. You can definitely make that argument. But what I found interesting was, again, from a progressive Christian point of view, this was the salvation of the world. Everything must change. Mm-hmm. And for me, and I mean, I'm always being asked about issues around, circling around conspiracies at the world level, especially when it comes to the United Nations and world federalism. It's not a conspiracy; it's a movement, and it's a movement based primarily in the religious philosophical idea that man saves himself.
Yeah. So that's
what's so important for people to realize.
So that brings us to the question of why should Christians care about this? And I think what you're saying is that we should care about it because of the motivations behind it.
Right.
The anti-Christian motivations. In other words, it's a religious motivation. It's not just some secular motivation. It's not merely a pragmatic thing, although you could argue that pragmatics is involved. It is. Mm-hmm. So you have to wonder what would the status of Christians be in such a one world government? Where would we fit in? How would we be forced underground like we were in Roman times, or what would be entailed in there?
I think, Ron, you can already have a bit of a glimpse of what that looks like through the World Parliament of Religions. Yeah. Progressive evolutionary Christianity is big thumbs up. Fundamental exclusive Christian claims, big thumbs down. Mm-hmm. And you are branded as the enemy.
Now, Paul, when he was speaking to the Athenians on Mars Hill, he said that God made from one man. In Greek, it just says from one. He made from one. And I think the King James has from one blood, which I kind of like that translation. But you could also say from one man, every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling places. Of course, he's talking about national boundaries or empire boundaries or whatever. And there's a reason for that. In other words, God has a reason for separating people into nations. Mm-hmm. Now, these boundaries are determined for allotted periods of time. In other words, nations come and go, empires come and go. It's all part of God's plan. And the reason is that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each of us. In other words, it was part of common grace. It was part of God giving man the opportunity to search for him. And it stands in contrast to the efforts to abolish this way of doing things. In other words, when you consciously abolish the whole concept of separate nations and separate realms and so on, what you're doing is you're going against God's plan. God, from the very beginning, wanted man to separate and disperse. At the Tower of Babel, man's plan was to bring everything together, concentrate it, as a way of salvation, their idea of earthly, worldly salvation. Lest we be scattered. In other words, it was like some terrible thing to be scattered. Well, it was.
And one of Carl's points, and I want to come back to Carl on this, in his book, and in several times as we've had him on here to talk about this, is we are again engaged in the same battle. As Ralph Babineau pointed out, man saving himself sounds like recycled heresy to me, he writes, which is true.
Yeah.
The battle has always been God saving mankind versus man saving mankind. There's a religion of man versus the religion of God. And we are in a decidedly post-Christian world, not just a post-Christian America, but a post-Christian world in which it is okay to have blacks kill blacks in Africa by the thousands and get zero press coverage. But if a black, and it was murder, is killed by a police officer in America, that is gives everyone the right to go out and burn and pillage and loot businesses and wound 800 officers and kill, 30 or 40 other ones. I don't understand how that works, except it's the religion of man versus the religion of God. It's a post-Christian world versus a world in which we said certain things are morally wrong and we should hold people accountable for that. Why? Because God said they're morally wrong.
Mm-hmm. Well, you go back to the original Tower of Babel, and God had given a specific command to scatter throughout the earth. And man's specific reason for not doing that, for building the Tower of Babel, was let us make a name for ourselves. Okay, we're gonna build a tower. We're gonna make a name for ourselves. We're gonna be famous. We're going to be. People are going to look to us instead of to God, lest we be dispersed over the face of the earth. In other words, that's what we want to be saved from. We want to be saved from what God intended for us. We want to be, and why? But Paul says, well, why did God intend that for you? So that you would seek him. But instead, you wanted to make a name for yourselves. So that man's view of salvation is worldly, it's earthly, it's earthbound. It is political, social, and economic. And God's purpose of salvation is to know him, to seek him and to know him. And of course, yeah.
So what do you do? Because they do realize that a lot of us are not going to agree with what's going on. Ron and I, for example. What do they do with opposition? How do they talk about that?
They talk about opposition, obviously in more negative language, that we are a challenge that needs to be
overcome.
I don't want to use the word overcome. That's kind of the language that comes out of it. Or the other way of looking at it is to win us over and to integrate.
Re-educate.
Yes. I mean, at the Parliament of World Religions in 2018, they had a workshop on how to reach out to evangelicals, specifically how to reach out to evangelicals so that we could accept the interfaith program and become an active player within interfaithism. Right. So it goes beyond just re-education. There is a carrot here that they're offering, and this is what we need to do. So you do see different elements of this. I have seen open hostility to Christians when I've been to different events like this. Absolutely, no question. Then I've seen the idea of re-education. We all need to be educated. This is why you see, even within school systems, the concept that's constantly being pushed on kids, you have to be a global citizen. That is a type already of re-education. Your worldview is going to shift.
If instead of a carrot, they dangled a donut in front of us, or maybe bacon,
it looks good, right? It does look good.
What is it that they're dangling? What is it that they're offering? What is this carrot?
They're offering inclusion.
Oh,
they're offering you being a place at the table. That's right. A place at the table. Absolutely.
And,
That is
and
essential.
they would say, in fact, I was at that workshop Carl was talking about. They're not saying that you have to give up your view of Christianity. You can be included right along with all of the other as an equal partner. But in saying that, what they're saying is you have to give up your view of Christianity because Christianity is by nature exclusivistic.
Right. Right.
Right? It is inclusive in the sense that anyone can be saved. It is exclusive in the sense that there's only one way to salvation.
Which really is just like their view. It's for everybody.
Pretty much.
But it's but it doesn't, not everybody is going to be part of it. If they reject it, they're going to be doomed. So, yeah.
In 2010, I had the opportunity to go to the G8 World Religions Summit. A lot of people don't realize that when the G8 and the G20 come together politically, there's also an interfaith side. And at that one in 2010, it was mostly made up of Christian organizations. Other religious groups were represented. We had representatives from Saudi Arabia. We had representatives from the Hindu community, the Baha'i. And it was kind of crazy to sit and observe, as including some major evangelical groups, groups that you guys would recognize. Jim Walsh was there.
Oh,
World Vision.
No,
I know
he's not evangelical. Jim Walsh is.
No, I know that. I know that. But he, again, his stuff, his ideas circulate. World Vision was there. In my country, the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada was there. A lot of churches and groups. And what was it about? Well, hey, we had 4 days of talking about restructuring the United Nations. 4 days of talking about global governance. Carbon taxes, the same thing we just finished talking about for the last hour. So the idea isn't that far from home. Again, it's a visionary concept of building heaven on earth, and that's really what it boils down to.
Now, first of all, I like to acknowledge what Penn Gemin said, a place at the table as an entree. It's like, it reminds me of that episode from the Twilight Zone, To Serve Man. It's like, but as I hear you talk about people going to these seminars and conferences and whatever, workshops, how do we change the world? I'm thinking of like my neighbors and my relatives and thinking of how their eyes would glaze over. And it's like, why would anybody spend any time doing any of this nonsense? It's not going to accomplish anything. Nothing. They're not going to get it done. Nobody's going to go along with it. But, that's kind of the way I feel. It's like these dupes, it's like, what are they? It's like, go play golf or something, you'll get a lot more done. Go clean your room or something, So, okay. But then I realized that they are building an infrastructure, an ideological infrastructure. They're placing themselves on the stage to wait for the play to start, wait for the curtain to open.
Well, they kind of are now. We're in our overtime segment here, so let's kind of move on
to
wrap
double
up.
Overtime.
Yeah, double overtime. Carl, how should we view the drive that they are making really toward a one world government? Yes, they're trying to use language that is more subtle, global governance, when in reality what they're looking for is a global government. It's not an obvious conspiracy, but it is a conspiracy nonetheless. What is a healthy way that we can try to understand this, and how should we? I know you and I are we like to go to these things because we want to know what they're up to. How should others think about how to interact with this information?
First, you need to see it as a movement, and not necessarily as a conspiracy. Call it what it is. It's a movement. It's a network, ideologically, spiritually, even politically, but it is a network. And that's important to keep in mind, that it is a movement with discernible goals, discernible organizations. They have budget lines that they meet. My goodness. This isn't just simply a bunch of men in a smoke-filled room and some kind of shady goings on.
Tammany Hall, New York, boss
right.
tweed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are budget lines being met here. There's literally agendas. There are people. This is a movement, and that's the important thing.
It's not just the
Right.
Society for putting things on top of other things, or the Ministry of Silly Walks. It's
right. It is a bona fide, legitimate movement, and so that's important for people to realize. The second thing we have to realize is, what is the movement ultimately about, and that comes into the realm of religion and philosophy. And the movement is ultimately about creating heaven on earth now, building heaven on earth here. That's really what this is about. And so as we think about it, to think about it in a healthy way is to recognize two things. Number one, this is a movement. It's real. It exists. It does happen. And yes, it does influence people. It influences your school education. It influences curriculums in a significant way. It influences the television shows you watch, the movies you watch. It's in your culture.
If it's just one thing you said, influencing curriculums, whatever. I mean, in other words, they're trying to get it into our kids' heads.
Right.
It is in our kids' heads. That's the thing.
Really,
it is in our kids' heads.
I mean, I read about one world government going back, read it in books, I read it in encyclopedias. It wasn't overtly taught to me, but it was available to read about. Now you're saying it's already in curriculums?
Absolutely. And it's not necessarily saying world government, it's saying things like climate change, sustainable development.
So things that bring us together as a planet, save the planet.
That's right. And if you want to understand where that comes from, you go right back to what we've just been talking about for the last hour.
So what you're saying is
that's where it comes from.
It's focused on a particular, all this is focused on a particular goal, is what you're saying.
Right, and moving in one direction. And the only way to accomplish it in the end is by having a one world government that will enforce on all nations to carry this out or be penalized for it.
Now, I think I'm remembering, I mean, back in the 40s, 50s, and probably even now, I don't know. America was, many Americans were haunted by the prospect of communist cell groups in their country, and probably in Canada too. And they existed, and they were planning, and we could go downtown Chicago and get a copy of the Daily World any day of the week, right, Don? You could,
absolutely, yeah.
Or the Daily Worker too. I remember reading communist newspapers back in the 70s and 80s. They weren't hiding that. But back in the 50s, you really had to hide it. I mean, you could get arrested just for being a communist back in the 50s. And so people said, well, it came to nothing. There was never a communist uprising in our country, except until Antifa came along, maybe you could say. But, except now in Seattle but it never really materialized. So what do you say to people who will dismiss this as just a redo or redux of that whole thing that we went through?
That's actually not that difficult to have a rebuttal for. Did it happen in America? No, but it sure happened in China. It happened in Mozambique. It happened in Korea. It's happened all over the place. And that itself has impacted your nation.
So all you need is enough, perhaps in this country, all you need is circumstances to begin to mirror what happened in those countries for those elements to take over.
Sure. And this is not the first time. Joyce's grandfather very nearly got involved in communism during the Depression era. It was very popular. And so we have been here before as a nation. This is just on a global scale for the same kind of a thing. So, Carl, I thank you for being here again. I want to bring up, if I can manage to do this without losing everything.
Don't lose everything. Just lose half of everything.
or without, you don't mind if I lose my mind, as long as I don't lose, okay. But I do want to do this so that people know they can go and look on our description here and get the link to go get Carl's book, Game of Gods. It is not a short book. It is a lot of information involved there, and it is very helpful to understand what all of this is going on here, because it is the religion of man versus the religion of God.
Yes.
Just a quick wrap up, Carl. How can people get in touch with you if they want more information, and how can they pray for you and about the situation?
For more information about the work we do, you can go to gameofgods.ca, read excerpts of the book. You can look me up on Facebook and on Twitter. I'm very active on both those platforms. And then in terms of prayer, pray that as we continue to pursue open doors, to go to events, whether they be virtual or in person, that we be able to do so that we can continue to inform, to challenge, and to equip the believer to understand the changes that are taking place in this world right now.
All right, Ron, would you care to walk us out of here?
I can't think of anything I'd rather do, except I would like to have Carl here for longer, but hey, we got to go sometime, right? Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our culinary services come from Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage is provided by Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormon archives manager is Polygamus, and our liberal denominations bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys is OD Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Your Leg Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Mookie Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham & Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Yvonne Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wiretapping. And our original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never. And we appreciate Emergency Manicure Productions for sure.
Yeah, I wish they took care of bee stings on my foot. That is really starting to hurt.
Well, I just wish you'd be happy.
Be happy. I got a bee sting. It's a week ago, and it's okay.
Carl, hold on. Ron, I don't care if you hold on or not. Everyone else,
bye.
say goodbye. Bye.
That's all, folks.
Bye.
He doesn't care.